Welcome to the Livecast. My name is Glen Scrivener, and if you haven't joined us before, we want to talk about the big issues of the day, looking through the lens of Jesus Christ. We think that with Jesus at the center of all things, that they start to come into focus. And what everybody's been talking about for the last couple of weeks at least has been the death of George Floyd and all sorts of reaction to the issue of race, both in the States, but from the States, there have been reactions all over the world as people are staring in the face of some ugly racism, but not only looking at the racism out there in the world, but there might be race issues in the church. There are race issues in the church, and we want to think about those, face those, so that together as a united body of Christ, we can go out into the world as witnesses to the multicultural, multi-ethnic harmony that is found in Jesus. We've done a number of programs on this issue, and we also today want to discuss not only the issues of black and white in the UK church, but so often in the UK situation we think about black, Asian and minority ethnic issues, the BAME. And so not only the black and white issue, but also other Asian and minority ethnic issues that need to be spoken of in the church. So my two guests today are Tope Koleoso and Aneal Appadoo. And we're going to talk to them about their experience in the UK, their experience of racism, both in the church and outside, and also what is the hope for churches that are truly multi-ethnic, multicultural, united together in Jesus. So let's go across to Enfield and Tope Koleoso. And thank you so much for joining us, Tope. Could you just introduce yourself to us and a little bit about Jubilee Church there in Enfield?
Well, thank you, Glenn. It's great to be here and a real joy to be able to participate in this. So my name is Tope Koleoso, and I'm married to Kemi. We have two sons and two grown sons, and been pastoring Jubilee Church London for coming up to about 20 years. And the church was planted actually from South London when we moved to be a part of that church plant. And then things have continued. I beg your pardon, I've been leading it for about 14 years. So the first few years, somebody else was leading, and then I took over. But Jubilee Church London is a very diverse and we would say a multicultural church. There are over 70 different nations in it, and I guess that probably more than anything probably reflects London, because London is very diverse, and so we have different nationalities in it, and it's a joy, and we keep learning the whole journey of gospel and diversity and multiculturalism together.
And that is something that's very intentional on the part of yourself and the other leaders, that is multi-ethnic something that's kind of fallen into your lap, or has it been something that you've really had to cultivate?
It is something that we have had to intentionally cultivate, so that it is in our minds, in our decision-making processes, it's reflected in our budgets, it's evident in our leadership, it goes right through the DNA of the church. It's something from the very outset that I felt the Lord put on our hearts. It's who we want to be. And so there's nothing accidental about it. And I think it hardly ever happens and functions rightly accidentally.
Right. Why? What is it that works against this intentional desire for a multi-ethnic unity, that diversity? What is it that works against that as a goal?
Well, I think many things do. I think culture does. I think people come with different cultures, and wherever there is a dominant culture, it can feel like, or deliberately or inadvertently, it smothers out the minority culture, sometimes without realizing it. I think that people want to go where they feel they're going to feel valued. They're not going to have to explain themselves all the time. And I think that if people go to a workplace that is very diverse and so on. Every so often, they want to be amongst their own people group where there's a peace and a rest and they can just be. But I think most of the time, a lot has to do with the leadership and how the leadership is going to be all encompassing, all embracing of all the people, and recognize where their own hurts and pains, challenges, difficulties, and joys are, and cry with them, celebrate with them. It's just a myriad of things.
So it's starting with the leadership. Is one key facet to this, that the leaders need to embrace this vision. In a second, I'd love to ask you why we want to be multi-ethnic in the first place, and then the big question, the $1 million question, is how do we go about it? I'd love to get into that. But before we get into that, and before we introduce Aneal, our second guest, Tope, can you just explain to us a little bit what has been your experience as a black man in the UK from Nigeria originally? How has that affected the way that you've navigated life in the UK? How has that been a difficult thing for you? Are there examples of discrimination that you've had to live with? And what has that looked like for you?
Well, I think that for me, and different people will have different experiences. And so let me put that up front. Let me also say that a person's experience might sound like it's not a big deal, but the point is how it affects them is the issue. And so for me, a black guy come to this country, and so my own experiences actually go way back because as you perhaps I get a degree of move up the ladder is somewhat, the nature of the racism changes, and it goes from being overt to sometimes covert, but it's always still there. It's funny, I was talking about this with my son the other day, and he kind of began to speak. It was about his own first experience, or certainly one of his first experiences. We were in the car together, we were driving to a prayer meeting, and I remember the incident. And a police car comes and it just stops me driving. And the policeman comes out, I'm in the car, and he walks over. It's a white police officer. Here I am, black guy. He looks in and he asks me, where am I going? What am I doing? And, now let me say this. He was pleasant enough. He didn't come up. He wasn't brash, angry, arrogant. It wasn't anything like that. He just came, he looked into the car and asked me all these questions. Where am I going? What am I doing? And so on. And then I said, yeah, we're just going to such and such, and gave the answer. And he said, right, is this your car? All the usual questions. And it was fine. To which he said, okay, oh, that's fine then. He said, I'm sorry I stopped you, but you can just imagine, you see a black man with a cap who's driving and there's a child beside him. You just got to check what it is. But I can see you're a respectable person, off you go.
Wow.
Now, that incident, so to your question, what are my own experiences? That is one experience, but what I thought is interesting about that is the two sides of it. For me, he was done, he was gone. I engaged the gear, and it was just another incident. It was not a big deal at all to me because it had come and gone. My son, on the other hand, was confused. Okay, he must have been about 10 years or something like that. He's like, I don't understand why, what was the problem that he came in the first place? So he began to realize, oh, wait a minute. So being black is a problem. And you kind of have to prove that you are not a problem to the guy. So you imagine that. I used to work in a hospital, and in those days, doctors would wear lab coats and so on. I ran the pathology laboratory. I was the chief biomedical scientist there. I walk out of one of the buildings there on the one day. I see a man, he's trying to help his wife, who's in a wheelchair, and it's a patient. The man is bringing his wife, who's a patient. They're both Caucasians. I see them, and I go to help them. And his words, his actions, his attitude, he told me, You get that. He just kind of told, commanded, all of that, belittled. And it's a sense of, if you want to understand what racism looks like, sense of one person feels inferior and they make the other inferior, or the other ought to know he's inferior. And I took them. When he was speaking, it was so rude, but sometimes it's just a person's attitude. Well, eventually, so many other things I realized, this is just race. And I helped the guy, I'm living with his wife. Well, of course, a few hours later, he's going to be prepped for surgery. My input is needed to decide if he will go to surgery. I go back. I didn't even realize it was him. I see the name, the things waiting on my desk to just assess it because of he had to do a transfusion. I go there to sit, and there he is. And then he realizes who I am and so on. And it was just a very awkward moment. And I continued. Those are just some.
Did you allow him to feel that awkwardness?
I guess it's a funny thing. I think many people, my generation and above, learned to normalize racism. The generation below me reject and refute racism. And so when you see some of the protests going around, I see a lot of them are younger people. There's a reason. They grew up in this country. They are Black British. They know nowhere else but here as home. They thought they were all equal. Then they grow older. They have all the degrees and everything. And they find out it's not equal. And then they respond differently.
Yeah. I'm hearing some nods of agreement from Aneal as well. Let's move across. Move south to Surbiton, and we've got Aneal Appadoo with us. He's on staff at Christchurch Surbiton. Aneal, could you just introduce yourself to us? And I wouldn't ordinarily ask you to discuss your heritage and ask where you come from and where does that name come from, but with this episode, you'll all give me a pass on that, won't you? Aneal, tell me, where are you from, and how has your ethnic heritage shaped the way that you've navigated life in the UK?
So Glenn, thank you for inviting me on your show. It's really wonderful, especially listening to your show for such a long time, to now be able to see you face to screen to face, I guess. And Tope, lovely to meet you as well. So my name's Aneal Appadoo. My heritage is that my father is Indian Mauritian. So in Mauritius, there's three predominant cultures: Indian, Chinese, and African. And so my dad's from the Indian Mauritian side, originally coming from Andhra Pradesh in India. So my mum's white British. So that's my heritage, if you like. I'm married to a wonderful wife, Sabrina, whose father is also Indian Mauritian and her mother is Filipino. And together we have two gifted children, Jacob and Isabel Rhodes.
Fantastic. And so have there been likewise, experiences of racism in your past, and how has that affected you growing up in the UK?
Yes, I was reflecting on this. I remember when I was doing my training at Bible College, I had to go to I was on a placement at a church up the road in Potter's Bar, and I remember I had to do a preach for part of my assessment, and I opened my preach by using sticks and stones may break your bones, but names will never hurt you, as kind of an illustration, and I used it as a jump off point to talk about my experience of racism. So growing up, quite regularly experienced a lot of verbal abuse because my father is Indian, and I'd get the kind of names that they're quite derogatory names for Indian people, really. And I was attacked quite a few times. My brother also. Where we grew up, weren't many people of, I guess, African heritage, but certainly Sikhs and Indians quite predominant. And I used this illustration in a sermon, and afterwards the curate came to speak to me and said, "Great sermon, but your illustration wasn't really helpful." Why is that? No one here has experienced racism, and that was a real moment for me. I thought I had assumed for, I don't know, 23, 24 years that everyone at some level has experienced some sort of racism. It's just normal for me. And I guess like Tope, I'm probably a slightly younger generation, but for me, just grew up with it and thought nothing of it. But then I was awakened to think that no, that's not the experience of the rest of the world. And that was quite opening for me. So growing up, said a lot where we grew up, a lot of verbal and physical abuse. I was the only Asian person. Now my skin's much paler than it used to be, but the only Asian person in my junior and infant school that I can remember. I remember people used to laugh at us for smelling of curry. We'd go to school, and my sister used to be really upset and wouldn't want to eat curry at home. And it wasn't until she was late 20s. Mum and Dad said, "Why do you hate curry?" "Oh, I love curry," but all my friends laughed at me when I came in smelling. It makes me a bit tearful thinking about it, smelling this way. I think in secondary school, in our cohort, one of 2 or 3 Asian-looking people, and we were close friends with a group, but the only ones in the school really who weren't white British, I guess, and that was our experience growing up.
What is it about racism as a dynamic, as a thing that is so grievous to the heart of the Lord? What would you say theologically about the problem with racism?
I think several things. I think rooting it back to Genesis 1 and our imageness, the fact that everyone in the world is made in the image of God, so we have a God-given birth, or before birth in the womb, we are God-given bearers of God's image, and that gives us a particular thing that I remember Tom Holland speaking about on his recent book Dominion, how actually that one thing was unique in the world in terms of bringing around equality and the end of slavery and other things. But then when you trace the theme, particularly of light to the nations that we see in the Bible with Abraham and the promise to him back in Genesis 12 of the Israelites being a blessing to all nations, and then coming to Isaiah and you have just a list of a covenant for the people, a light to the nations, I'll make you a light to the nations, a salvation to the ends of the earth. There's this sense in the as we trace the Old Testament narrative that Israel was supposed to be not just one ethnic group that blessed each other, but was to be bring God's blessing to everyone. And then in Jesus we see that so much. I mean, how he is the light of the world, how he is the light to all. And then he ends Matthew's gospel in Luke's beginning of Acts says, go into the ends of the earth and make disciples of the world. So not just are we all image bearers, but something of what Jesus came to do was to unify and bring all the nations under one banner. And it's interesting at the very end of Revelation, we often talk about how in Revelation it says, every tribe, knee and nation before the Lord in Revelation 7. But Revelation 22 says this interesting line, looks into it, but where it says, that there's the tree of life is on both sides of the bank, and its leaves are for the healings of the nations. So there's something end to end in the Bible about how we don't get to the end of, unfortunately, we don't get to Genesis chapter 22, the very end, before we hear that the nations are finally healed. Now, whatever it looks like, I imagine that has something to do with injustice and racism, as I read that. So maybe that's just a lens I read it from my own heritage.
Yes. And it just fascinates me that in Revelation that ethnicities will persist into glory. So the idea of being colorblind is like, we understand what people mean when they say, I don't even see you as black. I don't even
That's
see,
not the gospel. Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah. What would you say to someone if they said, I'm just colorblind? What would you say?
So again, I think Tope mentioned this a bit earlier. I think it depends how you hear things. So for one person, for friends, they would hear something like that and be quite angry, because actually their colour means a lot to them, whatever that might be. Whereas for me, mine is more a point of grace and saying, actually, it's with our, not just our colour, but the culture we bring with us that makes the diversity, breadth, and glory of the gospel so beautiful. I mean, you can't have a gospel of unity when everyone's the same. It's when iron sharpens iron requires iron filings to fall off each other as we're rubbed up against each other. So it's as we are knocked about and banged up against each other. And if two people, I don't know, like the same music, watch the same movies, listen to the same stuff, there's not much knocking about there. But when you bring another person into that mix, you then begin to say, okay, we have a difference here we need to work through. I guess as one anecdote, my wife is a counselor psychologist, and when we met, I found her a bit combative. And the reason was, when she was training to be a psychologist, she'd sit with her whole cohort of 12 or 13 people, and they'd have to, if they'd experienced a difficulty with someone, they'd have to openly say, you did this to me, it made me feel like this, you need to make a repair, we need to talk about that. And I find so often in modern culture, particularly in white Western culture, so Indian culture isn't necessarily an issue, we bottle up our emotions, we don't talk about them as much, we don't talk about differences, and we're afraid, particularly politically correctly, to speak about these sorts of things. Whereas I find when actually if someone says something to us, we speak the truth in love, and we say, what you said offended me in this way, but let's talk about how we can move forward on that. And that's the sort of conversation we don't tend to have.
Yes, yes, and we'll talk about how those conversations happen across racial lines and across cultural lines when different people have different experiences with words and how freely they share them. So even just as an Australian living in the UK, I recognise that people have very different attitudes to bottling up emotions or letting it all out, as Australians tend to. But Tope, just on that issue of the goal being colorblindness. I mean, I completed all my schooling in the 1900s, but that was the thing in the 90s. It seemed to be certainly, in my experience, that I'm not a racist. I don't even see race. That tended to be the thing that was said. Is there anything good about that, or what would you say against the idea of colorblindness?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Aneal, what he said there has just been extremely helpful, because implicit in that and in the Bible and in God's joy, what he wanted to make, he made them different. So they are not an aberration of environments. They are not whatever. God wanted it that way. And for God, it is beautiful. It is good. And so the expressions of the diversity, to me, shows the mastery of God over all things and his sovereignty. He wanted it so. So he made the ethnics. Paul says, God who had this God you worship, not made by human hands, Acts 17, nor is he governed by human hands, but he made all things. And then he gave to them periods and boundaries and dwelling places. And so for me, when a person says, I don't see it, there's a problem there. And so they need to be helped to see it. Because what you're not seeing is, so let's go to the word, is racism, is what we're talking about here, okay? So it's not just the color, because with the color comes so much else on how a people group are being treated. If you don't see the color, you're certainly not going to see how they're being treated. Yeah. So this is a far deeper thing. I think of prejudice, and I forget who puts this together, but I think prejudice being the way you think negatively about somebody else, consciously or unconsciously. Discrimination is now you begin to have actions towards that person, one way or the other. Racism is when the system is built over time against one people group, or at least it doesn't benefit one people group. One lot are victims, the other lot are beneficiaries, but the beneficiaries don't see it. Why? I think it's a good question you ask. I just can't see it. Why, when a black person says, well, those opportunities are just not open to me? So, what do you mean? Just apply for the job and just go. And it's like a person standing against a bird in a cage, and your face is so close to it, to the cage, that you don't see the wires. Just looking at the bird, I'm like, just fly, just go. You have to stand back and then see that, wait a minute, it's not just that easy. Or sometimes you stand against the cage and look at the pole, just one pole in a particular way. You think, okay, it's just one. You can avoid that, but not necessarily so. You have to stand back and then you see the interlocking networks of situations that conspire against. When you're the victim, you see the cage all the time. When you're the beneficiary, you just can't quite.
Can I ask about that? Because I totally agree that there is systemic racism and there are winners and losers in the system that we have, and that there are ways of having systems that can be racist even when individuals within it aren't intending to be racist, but it falls out that there are winners and there are losers. But is there a danger that if we're constantly saying that someone is in an oppressed people group, that they grow up thinking, oh, well, it can't happen for me. because I'm this kind of person living in this kind of culture, and that might breed a kind of a passivity if that's the only message that's heard. Is there a danger that might be the case?
Yes, I think you're right. I think that there is a danger of that. It's just that, however, the right things need to be said to the right person at the right time. Me, as a Black father raising two sons, didn't say to them, just so you know, everything is against you and life is over. But that would be totally responsible. I would say to them, no matter what is against you, you can do this. And if it means you have to work 10 times stronger, well, we might as well start now. And so I have to overcome that in their minds. I have two sons, they're not racist, but they have very good, strong, clear, biblical views that I love the strength of it, because if we just park it there with the, then the system issue never gets fixed. So on the one hand, I deal with this at a family unit as a Black man. On the other hand, I deal with it from this angle. And so it's a full-orbed thing. Right. But you're right, both are needed, and the right thing at the right time in the right way. For example, if you decided we're going to talk now, you're going to do a podcast completely about, I think Black people need to really help speak to their children to not believe, that there are things against you. Well, in the climate in which we are, in the moment that all this is going on, that becomes a rather unhelpful message. Not a lie in itself, but unhelpful. And so I think, I take your point. I hear what you're saying, and it's true. That and so I would say that to friends a lot. On the one hand, there is this, but on the other hand, you bring up your children, you speak to the community, I speak to the church in a way that is loving and winsome for all people.
I like that. So yeah, you can preach to structures and you can preach to individuals, and it's not always the same message. And a very interesting breakdown of those three things as well. Did I remember rightly? So prejudice is just this instinctual thing.
Yeah.
You might not even have thought about it. Discrimination is when you individually act on it. Racism is the more systemic thing. Is that sort of the three? Yeah. Very interesting. I'll have to think about that. Yeah, that's very good. Let's talk about so George Floyd and his tragic death lit a fuse that has led to an impact that's gone around the world. To what degree do you think American issues map onto UK issues? And maybe Aneal can think as well. To what degree do the Black-white issues map onto other areas of different ethnic struggles that people have? But do either of you want to comment on why? Yeah, how does the experience of African Americans in the States map onto a UK situation, and how does the Black-white issue interact with all sorts of other different ethnicities? What do you guys think?
Well, maybe the latter might be good for Aneal to speak into, because I think for obvious reasons. I guess, yeah, to the question, when you look at the American expressions of it, and one might look at that and think it's a lot more volatile. You might feel that it feels more volatile. It feels harsher. The texture of it is just so much grittier. I think a part of that would be that the civil rights movement is not so far behind us. I think that there are people who have lived it. They remember it, their families and so on. So the history is not so far away. It's very, very close. And of course, these things get passed down. And then when you add to that the fact that a nation like that, it's not reducing or even remaining the same. 50 years after Martin Luther King's death, things are, in certain ways just as bad. So I think that those are some of the reasons. I also think that, when you see what happened to George Floyd, when you look at that, there's a lot to be said about that, a lot to be said about it. Because And I know that we try to maybe not visit that particular incident much, but there's a reason we ought to. The black guy is on the ground. He's begging for his life by saying, I can't breathe. He's already handcuffed. There's a white policeman whose knee is against his throat. And the policeman's posture is somewhat triumphalistic almost in the way this thing looks. People are all around and videoing it. There are police officers, also others along there, these are all people to protect him. The video that I saw, somebody was saying, okay, just put him in the car. Put him in the car. He can't breathe, man. Put him in the car. And nothing happens until for 8 minutes. This is a long time. The guy dies. Now, there is an atmosphere, a way of life, a worldview, a systemic kind of sin in the fabric of society that can make something like that happen ongoingly, and everyone is chagrined to a spot as everyone watches a man get killed. If that happened to an animal, there'd be an uproar. The reason I'm saying that is that in America, it just feels far more drastic and raw. But it is here also. It tends to be more overt here as opposed to covert. There are, I guess one might say, maybe parties and so on that are far more militant, but for the most part, it's more covert. And so we can think, actually, it's not as bad, but it's the covert one that makes the atmosphere able to let the covert thing continue to get expressed. So there are differences, but there are a lot of similarities.
Yeah. Can I raise a couple of points? Because I'd love to get your sort of comeback on them, because these sort of points kind of swirl around on social media, as tends to happen on social media. But people will say, there was a case in Dallas in 2016 where a white guy had his neck kind of, lent on for 11 minutes and he died at the scene, and that kind of thing. And they'll want to say, is the George Floyd case definitely an example of race? It's definitely police brutality. Is it definitely racism? And how could we know that? What would you say to that?
I think that a black man knows what is racism when it happens. And as much as that answer will be insufficient for people who want to intellectualize it, theologize it, politicize it away, it is what it is. I think that it is racism because it happens a grotesque amount of time to a certain people group. I think that the reason why other black people around that incident did not go forward to release the man is because they knew what happens to a black man when it comes to that place. I think that the average black man looks at what happened just a few days ago, where a man is supposedly in his car, and whatever the state that he was in, the police come with the altercation and him trying to release himself. He is shot in the back, running away from the incident. So for me, the question is, the question perturbs me somewhat. Not you, but, and I know you're saying these are things that one sees up there, And so that would, I guess, just be my calm response to it. Maybe one other little thought in that regard. When things happen and you really want to help matters, I think you look at what is going on and try to address that. To flesh it out, to diminish what we just saw, is to become complicit, in my opinion, to it. I think that sometimes we jump very quickly to facts and ignore people's feelings and what just happened before us. And I think it's an injustice. I think when you're at home and your wife is maybe upset about something and the kids did this and did that, and there's just so much to do, and then you never help me, and you say, what do you mean I never help? I was in at 6 p.m. the other day. I was in at 5:45. In fact, this happened on January the 16th. And you have all your facts there, and they're all correct.
Yeah.
Your wife doesn't say, "Oh my goodness, you're right." She says, "You don't hear me." She says, "You don't empathize." She says, "You don't care." And she doesn't say the children are a problem. She says, "You are." Feelings matter. And so are there places for facts? Absolutely. But I think there's a way and a time to approach these things holistically.
Absolutely, and hence, wanting to address these issues on the live cast. Should we finish on some more positive notes about how it is that we strive towards that multi-ethnic vision, first in the church, but hopefully out there in the world as we witness to the way that different cultures can be united in Christ. Tope, how do you reach a place? You said that you've been intentional at Jubilee Church in terms of cultivating those 70 different sort of nations that are represented there. How do you cultivate that kind of culture in which we prize our diversity?
I think that the leader and the leaders, they need to be persuaded biblically. I think that's where I go first. I need to persuade it thoroughly biblically that this is in the heart of God, and that only the gospel can bring complete resolution to this. So for me, that is a conviction that will not shift. And therefore, I need to be convinced biblically. And if I'm persuaded biblically, then now I need to teach it regularly to people. It's an interesting thing. When I think of teaching, to be honest, I think when I think of doctrine, I think Jesus. And he's able to reconcile all things and all people to himself. So I think if we will preach Jesus Christ authentically, powerfully, passionately in relation to this and other issues, I do believe that if everyone, this is the picture I have in my mind as a pastor every Sunday, if I can get them all to look to him, I do believe their hands will raise out and hold each other. And the colors become not the primary thing that defines you as a person, but Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, becomes the chief thing, the chief one that defines your life. So it's the job of leaders to preach that and to help people. When he, like Tim Keller says, when the gospel has snapped inside you, the difference happens. I like that very much. So I see it as my job. So we need to teach it. I think that there's some practical things we need to do. I think it's important to just acknowledge it. Racism is a real thing. In other words, don't just go for diversity. The world has changed since George Floyd, in my opinion. Going for diversity is not enough. It used to be. Now you have to be anti-racism. And so a conversation with wise people who get the gospel will help in this regard. Whatever that looks like. Interview someone on a Sunday morning, let some normal people speak about their own expressions and feelings and so on, and video it, and just let there be a permission to talk about it. I think that has a way of just diffusing the angsts in people, and they come down, because most people just really want to be heard. At least in church, my church understands, my pastor understands, my brothers and sisters get it. And it becomes a safe place for the minority there. I think we need to work very hard to let diversity be represented in leadership. I think where that is done, it will be a massive help to the issue. I also think that, again, I say the world has changed, where that is not being done, and there are all kinds of cultures down there, but only one culture is up, leading and on the stage.
And visible.
I think now you're sending out a very negative message. Because George Floyd's situation, if people think it will go away nicely, you watch. I give it 1 year, there will be an anniversary of it. And the minority people in your congregation are going to ask the question, so what did we actually do? What did change? So I think everybody needs to think about it that way, that the things that needs to change. I do think we need to build wisely. It's by wisdom that a house is built. And so you have to be, you're not just taking people on account of their color. That is tokenism, and that will be found out, and that will be destructive. But I do think you go alongside people. One of the best things a leader can do, if you're a white pastor, I would be to have a black friend, a brown friend, and draw them close and let the friendship take its way. And organically at the right time, they open up to you. There is a unity and an intimacy that will happen that helps you be able to help other people. And then read a lot. Read some history. Get to know what exactly the angst is all about. And let me stop there.
Great. Theological as well as practical tips there. Aneal, what would you say moving forwards if we do have that anniversary of George Floyd's death and we look back in 12 months' time? What would you have hoped that we could have put into practice?
A lot of wisdom, I think, to what Tope said there, and brother, just to hear of your church. I mean, that is a picture of heaven, isn't it? Where the new creation, where every tribe and tongue, 70 nations represented, is such a, thanks be to God for your church, brother, and what He's doing through the ministry there. So what a wonderful light to the people of Enfield. For us, we have a number of nations represented in our church, from Sri Lanka and South Africa and Nigeria, Mauritius, Philippines, Spain, lots of other nations represented, and we actually just before the killing of George Floyd, I was in an online alpha course, and one of the ladies on the course was a Nigerian, and we were talking about prayer, and she was saying how she struggles to pray quietly, but what she loves is spirituals. She loves those sort of prominent in black churches and Pentecostal movements, those spiritual songs. And that took me back to in my last church, we had a Nigerian family, a bit of a statesman in the church, and whenever he came up to pray, he always began his prayers by singing a spiritual, like "Soon and Very Soon" or something like that. So that got a conversation going in our staff team about actually how do we recognise the diversity, the glorious breadth of our church family on a Sunday. So we're talking about having spirituals being sung and that sort of thing. We say, what do the band play? We say, well, maybe not. Maybe we ask people who actually, this is their music, rather than the predominantly non-ethnic band picking up their music and playing it. Why don't we ask people who know this music to play it? From my culture in Mauritius, are there prayers and blessings? We have a very famous French missionary called Pierre Laval, who's quite prominent on the island. He died many years ago. Are there blessings and prayers that he used, scriptural and biblical, that we could use in our services? So how as a church do we recognise regularly up front, not just in our leadership, and we have our leadership is quite diverse. We've got 3 clergy. I'm Indo-Mauritian, our curate is Nigerian, and our main pastor is a white man, so we're quite diverse from the front. But how do we, across the life of the church, just say to everyone in the church family, just because we are a white middle class suburban church doesn't mean the flavour we have here has to be that way. What is the and forgive me, this isn't meant to be derogatory in the term, but what is the spice that the different members of the congregation bring? How do we, from our Sri Lankan heritage, from our Nigerian heritage, from our South African heritage, what is it that we can bring that just shape our classic Anglican white church to be something that is more in heaven? We're going to be saying alongside Bible College, we have a association with Nigeria, and there's some certain chants and phrases that always come out in a few weeks after a Ugandan mission. So I imagine that in heaven, I'll have my Ugandan brothers standing alongside me with their chants, and I'll be singing my Wesley hymns, that sort of thing. So how do we get to taste that now in this creation, so we're ready for it in the new creation? I think also things like, if you have people from other nations in the church, ask them about it. Where do you come from? And if you get a pushback, you asking that because of a kind of skin. Well, yeah, I am. You do look a bit different. So tell me about that. Where do you come from? What is your story? What is great in your culture? How can we come alongside you? Learn a language. We have people in our church who have fled Iran, so learning how to say hello and peace with you in their language, so that actually we're having to speak that way. I did in my last church, we had a wedding for a Hungarian couple, so I learned some Hungarian. So the wedding, when their parents couldn't speak any English, and I was asking them questions: who gives this this woman to be away. I could say it in Hungarianese. So I don't know what the language is.
In Hungarian, yeah, fantastic.
Wow. I could say it so that they were part of it. So how are we intentionally trying to be inclusive? It's interesting that in the Bible, God always has a heart for the other. That famous line that runs all the way through the Bible, particularly in Isaiah and elsewhere, for the orphan, the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, and how not to glean your harvest to the edges, but to leave it there for the stranger and the other. And God has always had a heart for those, the minority groups who weren't Israelites, who were from the tribes around or had been brought into Israel, actually to be part of what's going on rather than just to be an excluded minority. And so it's such a prominent role given to them suggests to me that even if we have one person of an ethnic diversity in our church, then we should have a heart to celebrate what makes that diversity there rather than just say, well, it's only one person, so you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, that's great.
Isn't that good? I've got this image of you going on holiday to Hungary now, Aneal, and the only phrase you can now say is, who gives this woman to be married to this man?
Every time I meet a Hungarian person, I just have to say the phrase. I've forgotten it now, so it comes out wrong.
It only has limited usefulness.
Yeah.
It's not like, where is the swimming pool? It's, who gives this man to be married to this woman? Fascinating. And yeah, I love that you said as well, it's a taste of heaven, isn't it? It's a taste of heaven to see, to see not just diversity, not just anti-racism, but unity. We stand. Go on.
If I could, one thing, I think something that from my heritage, so again, Indian Russian, is the place of fellowship and meals. There's a book called A Meal with Jesus, where some commentator writes a book that says every time Jesus is featured in the Gospel of Luke, he's either going to a meal, at a meal, or leaving a meal. And there's something, again, within that culture of food and time together. I remember going to Southend-on-Sea as a kid in Essex from Kent, where I come from, but we drive to Southend. And I remember we used to knock on our uncle's house. It wasn't an uncle, it was a family friend, but we called him an uncle in Southend at sometimes 2 a.m. And he'd wake up his wife's sister lived with them, and they'd get some chicken fried and they'd make some breads, and we'd have, a meal together at 2 a.m, because actually when you enter someone's house, hospitality and generosity was central to what they did. I used to work in travel. I went to Sri Lanka and Peru and many places in the world. And I was always struck by how other cultures were so much more hospitable, so much more, they take a week of work to spend time with you. And then I recalled how I went to Mauritius with my family, and my cousins, doctors, nurses, they all took time off work to spend time with us. But when they came to visit us in England, I'm working, so you look after yourself, and I'll see you a bit later on. And actually, there's something about what other cultures have in terms of time with people, open doors. Whenever they knock, they can come in. I've got a thing in my ministry where I think every time we meet as a church, we should have a meal present. We should have some food there in some way to be able to sit down, relax, and enjoy food. So I think there's something that particularly other cultures can offer a white Western busy culture. Maybe it's just not a white Western busy culture, maybe it's a UK or middle class culture, but something of time together. There's often a line that Muslims say that in their religion, they say prayers 3 times a day. They spend the whole week together, and then they hear in church of Christians being family, of having fellowship. We are your family. We're here for you. We're thicker than brother and sister. And they come from a culture where their next door neighbour is their family. Everyone in the community is family. And they leave Islam, and that's a great wrench and a tear, and that's really painful. And often they lose family with that. And they come to church, and they turn up on Sunday, and church doors close, and they say to the pastor, "Great, we're family. When are we having dinner again?" "Oh, we'll see you 10:30 next Sunday." And actually, how do we break our own cultural rigidity about our time, our space, our family's needs to say, actually, this is the body of Christ. We are thicker than blood in that sense. How do we give our time freely to others? And I think other cultures have a lot to teach us about that.
I think you're right, Aneal, in what you're saying there. I think it's also very, very helpful. And just to realize that actually other cultures that are now living here, very often they've learned to bend to this culture and accept and be a part of and accommodate. And so one of the things that will just bless them the most is when they feel that others then bend the other way.
Amen. Yeah.
It's such a powerful thing. We do the same thing. We take a day in the year and we celebrate our diversity. In fact, we would have all the nations come out and everybody dresses up in their own native.
The food must be great at that.
Celebrate it, let the nations be glad, let all the nations be glad. And so the idea of nations is always been in us, and I think it's a helpful thing. I also think not just for us to have very good times and demonstrate unity powerfully, biblically, in a way that the world has never seen, because that alone is powerful in itself. but it does awaken and sets people up for missions.
Amen.
Where they realize
Yes, Lord.
actually, no matter where other people are, every tribe, they are God's people. And maybe beyond those I meet here, I'm sent to go there. And so, like you beautifully showed us, it's right across the scriptures from beginning to end. God loves diversity.
That's fascinating and very suggestive. I'll be thinking about that. Yes, to the degree that we are multi-ethnic will give us a taste for and a greater hunger for reaching the nations. Oh, that's very good. Thank you, Tope. Guys, thank you so much for joining us on this show. I feel that, I've learnt so much, and we'll be chewing on what you've said to us. If people want to continue learning from Tope, you can go to jubileechurchlondon.org. That's your website, isn't it? The church website, Tope. And on your homepage, you've got a great video responding to George Floyd's death and what we can learn and how we must change in the light of it. So I'd very much recommend that people go to jubileechurchlondon.org. You can get more teaching from Tope, and you can watch that excellent video. And Aneal, if there was any resources that you would point people towards as they're thinking about these sorts of issues, is there anything? I'm putting you on the spot now. Is there something you might point people towards?
To plug our website, as is ccsurbiton.org, and we had our live service group on there. We had an interview with Emmanuel, our curate, on Sunday, who's a Nigerian man, grew up in the UK. So that was quite helpful to hear his experience, much like Tope expressed today, actually, in his context. And for our congregation, many messages after that were quite opening to see, okay, well, this goes on in Surbiton as well. It isn't just, restricted to some parts of the world. To be honest, brother, I haven't read much on this, but the things I'm finding most helpful are a couple of podcasts. There's one called the Speak Life podcast. That's brilliant. That's really engaging and informative. I'm enjoying that lots. Also a recent podcast from friends, but a great organisation, Faith in Kids, Church Society as well. And finally, I found 9 Marks over in America producing some great stuff. And Jonathan Lehman, he had an interview with a pastor in America, I think last week, which expressed the church very similar to Tope's, where the pastor there had intentionally sought diversity, had hired people to staff team who were from a diverse background to build. I think their title was Minister for Diversity in Our Culture. And so the role was to build out diversity in church. And that was really fascinating. And how does a church seek in its structures to build out a diverse culture? So for me, podcasting what I tend to do when I'm doing washing up. So that's where I'd head.
Excellent. Great tips.
I've got to get this in, Glenn, and at the outset, and it's got nothing to do with race. So apologies right up front. So just cut this out if you want. But I think I was in Zambia somewhere, about to get on a plane, and was wanted to download something before I got on. Couldn't find a Wi-Fi, but somebody had just sent me, said, I think you'll like this. And it was a video of you preaching. And it was just a simple story about your own salvation and, about how Jesus saved you. And I am so glad I made all the effort to get it downloaded because I listened to it on the plane. And it was just so simple and powerful. And I guess I'm referencing it more because I want anyone listening to this to go find it out and watch it. I think it will really bless them. It will make a preacher want to preach the gospel.
Yeah. Let's do that. Let's preach the gospel. That sounds good. I'm all for that. Thank you, Tope. Brilliant. And if you guys want to find out more about the Speak Life podcast, you can go to speaklife.org.uk. But Tope Koleoso and Aneal Appadoo, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.